This is U.S. History 2, Chapter 7, Section 5, Shaping Peace in Europe. After 4 years of long fighting, the Great War was finally over, but Europe was left to pick up the pieces, and it was quite literally a mess. President Wilson, the United States President, created a plan for peace in Europe, and he had really come up with this plan around the time the United States entered the war, and he called it his 14 points. The points included freedom of the seas. There's no blockades or sinking of shipping supplies anymore in Europe. The reduction in military weaponry all throughout the world. All countries needed to reduce the size of their military. Part of the reason why World War I was so devastating was that all the countries around the world were just arming up. And with all these more arms and more weapons, they were just able to create such horrific battles. Limiting European nations' ability to colonize lesser nations. This is something that Europe doesn't like to talk about, but they would around this time, imperialism. They would just go around the world, taking over these weaker nations and just gathering up more and more of these small countries all throughout the world. And President Wilson thought that wasn't really the right thing to do, and he wanted to limit European nations' ability to colonize lesser nations to protect the native people, and then settled territorial issues in Europe. Part of the 14 points for peace. Let's draw these lines again. Let's set actual boundaries. Hopefully, we can draw boundaries that everybody can agree with. And then the dismantling of Austria-Hungary and Ottoman empires. Obviously, these massive empires needed to dismantle because the people living in these empires were not very happy, and they were of different ethnic groups. It was just such big empires that ruled so many different sects of people that those people should be able to rule themselves and not be lumped in all under one king. He wanted people to have this self-determination, is that smaller nations be able to decide their own form of government instead of being under a large empire or being colonized. He was big on that. And that's kind of what America is about. But President Wilson's most important point, in his opinion, was the 14th point, the last point, was create an international organization that would settle the world's disputes among nations around the world. Instead of having an entire world war about it, let's talk it out with an international organization. Like I said, its point was to prevent another world war from happening ever again, and it was to establish justice for all people in the world, whether they belong to a small or powerful country, and that's from President Wilson himself. So you can see, Germany asked for peace, and then Wilson has these 14 points ready. He was prepared for the end of the war and his plan for what to do after the war ended. So this is the 14 points in more detail. The leaders of the Allied forces met in Paris to discuss the 14 points. And there was 4 big leaders: President Woodrow Wilson from the United States, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau from France, England's Prime Minister Lloyd George, and Italy's Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. The European leaders did not share President Wilson's view of peace without victory. They just went through 4 years of war. The United States was only in the war for a year, and they didn't get the United States didn't get their countries bombed. France, England, and Italy did by the Germans, and then so they were, very outspoken about, no, it's not going to be peace without victory. We're going to make Germany pay. They wanted to punish Germany and ensure Germany would never do anything again. And it kind of bites them in the butt because about 20 years later, Germany starts another world war. So maybe if they weren't so harsh about them, would prevent another world war. But here's the leaders. There's Wilson, France's Clemenceau, Italy's Orlando, and England's David Lloyd George. So after long negotiations in Paris, the Allied leaders finally settled on a Treaty of Versailles, and that's the name of the palace in France. Where the negotiations occurred. Um, but the treaty was not kind to Germany at all. Germany was forced to give up German land to France, surrender all German colonies around the world, limit the size of German army to only 100,000 soldiers. That's not many at all. And pay massive reparations to England and France. And reparations are payments to cover all war damages. The amount was so inconceivable that there was no way Germany was going to be able to pay them back anytime soon. But England and France thought that was more than fair because they destroyed a lot of France, and they even bombed England. So some of the borders that were taken away. So this Rhineland, Germany had, that is now part of, it's going to be demilitarized. That means that there's no German army can be anywhere near this area. That's where the Western Front was. France gained the Alsace-Lorraine area after the war. Germany was forbidden to be in with Austria. So there's all these big things that Germany lost during this treaty. So the only reason why President Wilson was okay with all this was because he wanted that 14th point to happen. And without agreeing to all this harsh treatment of Germany, he would never have been able to get this 14th point. He didn't like that Germany was going to be treated this way. He kind of foresaw that Germany's going to be angry about this for a long time and might not prevent another world war. But he agreed because part of the treaty was that this international peace organization that he loved so much would take into effect. And it was called the League of Nations. And the goal was really to provide a place for countries to meet and settle disputes peacefully. German leaders begrudgingly signed the Treaty of Versailles, and the German people were angered by such horrible treatment. Like I said, 20 years later, another world war happens. Germany was already a mess. Now they have to pay all this money. They lost all their land. They lost all their colonies. How was Germany supposed to rebound after this? So, besides Germany, European colonies in Africa and Asia lost out in the Treaty of Versailles. All German colonies in Africa and Asia were divided up among England and France. So, it's not like the self-determination didn't really happen. These German colonies were just under a different rule now, England and France. So, they were in England and France weren't going to let these people rule themselves. America hoped that they were going to let them have self-determination, but didn't happen. The Ottoman Empire dissolved. Much of it was occupied by England and France as well. Ottoman Empire is Turkey, and it goes into the Middle East a bit, where there's a lot of oil. So England and France were quick to take those lands. New smaller countries were created out of the dissolved Austria-Hungary. You can see all these Austria-Hungary. It was all this. Now we got Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania. So these are all these little countries that were able to make new territories after World War I. So when President came back from Europe, the American people were not a big fan of the treaty. A lot of congressmen opposed the treaty because joining a League of Nations just sounded like the United States would be chained to these European nations and their interests and their disputes. After fighting war, that's just not something the American people wanted to do. A lot of people still didn't understand why the United States needed to join such a war in Europe. It seemed really far away. So President Wilson actually went across the country trying to gain support for Congress to approve the treaty, but he suffered a paralyzing stroke, and it really limited his ability to lead. He was he was bedridden for a lot of the rest of his presidency, and so he was unable to garner the support, and the Senate did not pass or agree with the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, the United States could not join this new League of Nations. So the whole point was, for, President Wilson, he created this League of Nations. The United States would head it. The League of Nations was created, but the United States was not a part of it. And because of this, the League of Nations really lost its ability to have any kind of influence in the world without the United States being a part of it. And then to make matters even worse, at the end of World War I, a new flu virus originated in Europe, and it started to spread throughout Europe. It was called the Spanish influenza. It created a worldwide pandemic, very similar to what we're going through with COVID right now. And it really got dispersed throughout the world because soldiers brought it home from Europe all throughout the world when they went back home. A pandemic, it's a virus or disease that spreads through multiple countries around the world. The Spanish influenza was highly contagious, very deadly virus. It spread throughout the world very quickly, and much like today, we took a lot of our lessons, what we did after COVID started, from what people did during the Spanish flu, quarantine, we isolated ourselves, public events were canceled, better practice of personal hygiene, like we wash our hands a lot more now with the hand sanitizer. Those people back then, just getting to wash our hands was probably big. All this was being enforced. So 500,000 people died in the United States alone because of this pandemic. And then worldwide, the Spanish flu killed about 50 million people. And the Spanish flu finally subsided a little bit by the summer of 1919, when many people developed a natural immunity to it. And that's kind of how the Spanish flu pandemic ended. We're still not sure. They didn't know a vaccine was created during this time. With COVID, we have a vaccine now, but we're just waiting it to be more massively dispersed, and hopefully at that time, our own pandemic will end.